So virtual land is becoming a formidable asset class in the metaverse. Over $500 million of virtual land sales were closed in 2021, and big brands are jumping into, everyone from JP Morgan to Atari wants a corner of the metaverse to call their own. So in this panel, we're going to hear from two early investors who recognize the trend before anyone else. I'm going to moderate this one, but please welcome to the stage cloudwhite and Ali Madhavji. Thank you for joining me here. So let's kick off with you, cloudwhite. So I first met cloudwhite at AxiCon Barcelona and was totally enamored with his story. So maybe you can share it with everyone here. Give us the background on you. How did you even end up buying virtual land?
Sure, yeah.
In Lenasia?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. Originally, just as a little backstory, I was a avant-garde film major, super lucrative. It was really working out for me. And I've always had a big passion for collectability. So I saw a Vox news story, actually. I think it was December 2017 on CryptoKitties. And I have a long history of collecting and understanding scarcity. And when I saw this little 5-minute clip on CryptoKitties, I was instantly like, that's the future, I'm jumping in. And so I was involved with CryptoKitties, and then, Dapper Labs obviously went on to build Top Shots and kind of left CryptoKitties off to the side. And from there, we saw these other teams emerging. So there was, the OpenSea team came from this community, and then the Axie Infinity community quickly rolled out from there as well. And that's when I actually met Jeff, who was just up here prior. And he was like, hey man, we're gonna build a digital pet game. You wanna come over? By this time, the original token sale had already happened. And so I kind of was involved, but I think it was shortly after that they did their initial land sale, and I was like, this is my opportunity. I'm going to go big. And I think since then I've been the second largest landholder in the Axie universe.
Wow, yeah. Second largest.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I want to come back to that in terms of investment theses. Sure. But Ali, we just met recently, so we're new friends. How did you get into this space of buying virtual land?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, early on, I used to collect a lot of stuff as a kid, right? So everything from hockey cards to basketball cards to baseball cards. I used to go get them signed when players were in town. We'd try to get full, mint condition collections. And then always sort of had a knack for these things. I mean, in school, in elementary school, if anyone ever needed any card in Pokemon or Magic, I was the one that could find you that card and would make a hefty premium on it. And so this actually worked really well because, already understood sort of a lot around collectability growing up, right? And then when you start thinking about NFTs, and I think a lot of times people sort of maybe have misconceptions about NFTs, but it's really the first way or first time in history that you can now track ownership in a digital world. And so NFTs was sort of the first part of it. And then in terms of land, was very fascinated with digital land, especially when there's scarcity aspects around it, right? And so there needs to be that commitment and trust when you're looking at teams. There was a lot of different things going on. There's, a lot of scammy projects as well in the industry that are doing stuff. And it's very hard to also trust that this is going to be scarce. They're not just going to sell another set or dilute it. And then there's the huge risk around execution and making sure that this is actually going to happen, right? Because oftentimes early on it's a promise. And so for Splinterlands, when I first got involved, so was very interested in buying it, had been reading about it. And funny story, I had just met my girlfriend at the time, and we set up a travel fund. And so she's like, hey, let's set up a travel fund because you're traveling a lot, it'd be good. So we put essentially a fairly large, reasonably large sum of money aside for a travel fund. And she's like, hey, I'm going out. I'll be back in a bit. She goes out for a run. And I'm like, okay, so she left. I got some time. I'm kind of bored. And I'm looking around. And then I see that the land sale is going on for Splinterlands. I'm like, all right, let's go. And so basically took the entire travel fund in 40 minutes and basically spent it on digital land. She gets back home and I'm like, yeah, so I spent it. And she's like, oh, spent what? And I'm like, oh, the travel fund. put it into land. And she's like, oh, that's a great investment. Like, what type of land did we buy? And I'm like, oh, well, you know, it's a little different. It's digital. And like, yeah, the rest of that conversation was not so good. But turned out to, in hindsight, to work really well. And we've, you know, continued holding on to that. And it's actually done really, really well.
Can I add on to that real quick?
Yeah, please do.
To add on to your point about digital scarcity, we had a kind of a meeting before we all came up here on stage, and that was something that we realized was very, we all had in common, right? This understanding of collectability, this understanding of scarcity. To your point, you know, believing that the team of whatever land you're buying isn't going to go and then, you know, keep, you know, increasing the supply was a big part of this, and understanding that there was going to be a limit to the metaverses that we were buying in. So it's a great point.
I got to say, when I heard Ali's story, I was like, cloudwhite is meant to be the degen on this panel. Like, yeah, so collectibles keeps coming up, right? And I think that was something for you in childhood too, right? You were talking about collecting, God, everything from Beanie Babies to lip smackers. Like, maybe you can talk us a little bit more through this idea of bringing that into digital worlds. Like, is that part of how you managed to recognize this trend before anyone else?
Definitely. I think that definitely played a big part. To your point, I collected everything under the sun. My parents weren't like, you know, if you're going to be into one thing, you got to be into that one thing. So I thank them for that. They were letting, you know, they let me explore a lot of different things. But I know that's what ultimately led to understanding, you know, NFTs as the future of collectability and scarcity. And then I think at the time specifically, my friend group was getting into real estate, you know, physical real estate. And I was like, I think I'm going to go the other direction and see where that takes me. And so they're all linked together.
Yeah, I guess you probably hear that from a lot of people, right? Like, you know, why would you want to buy virtual land when you could hold physical land? Obviously, you guys think differently about that. Like, Ali, what would you say about that? You had to have that difficult conversation with your girlfriend about, yeah, no, it's virtual.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of value when you have that scarcity aspect, right? And I think with physical land, like, it can still be a great investment. Obviously, you know, there's utility to being able to live in a place, but using sort of those same concepts, there needs to be utility to digital land, and you need to understand that and where it could go and what are the possibilities. How is this going to generate yield as well as potentially like a consideration? So like it's still some of the same types of considerations that you need to think about from that perspective, but it's just maybe a different approach that you just got to get over that one barrier of physical versus digital. But like a lot of the other aspects, you know, are probably even smoother, right? When you think about like rentals in the digital world, are a lot smoother than rentals in a physical world, and you're dealing with
or sales,
right? Or sales,
you know,
right? So a lot of these things are like hyper streamlined when you start dealing in a digital world. You know, you don't have things like, at least as of now, like destruction of your property or destruction of your NFTs, or like, you know, physical cards can get damaged and they're less valuable. You don't have these aspects necessarily in a digital world, which is, I'd say, a big advantage as well.
And to add to that, for me, I was just too poor to buy regular land. This was a much easier entry point, so that's how that happened.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that too. Like, I've heard that in the Philippines as well, like where I'm based and where Axie Infinity obviously took off in an amazing way in 2021. We did hear from a lot of people that they were very excited about that opportunity to be able to be a landowner when it might not actually be possible, say, in the physical world. Just quickly, we are going to open up to questions, maybe with about 10 minutes to go. So if you've got questions for the panel, do stick around till the end. We'll be handing it over to you. But in the meantime, got a question for you. So both of you, so you're in Lunasia, you're in Splinterlands. You've both retained very, very high conviction for those metaverses that you originally went into, where I'm sure plenty of other people have dropped out with the crypto market the way it is, or maybe they've moved into other places. So why do you still have such high conviction for those metaverses? Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can kick that off. I mean, I think what's very important in any startup, so we invest in a lot of startups. We now have 110 different startups that we've invested in around the world. And what's really important is one measurement that we like to use as sort of a very important measure in the startup world is progress over time. So how fast is this company moving in as little time as possible? And you've got to use that as well in understanding things like, you know, how much are they communicating in terms of their roadmap? Are they hitting targets on their roadmap? Are they actually making progress? And this is very critical. And I would say that, at least from my experience, Splinterlands has been one of the best in the world at this, right? And I mean, obviously, Axie has been sort of the other that I think has really stood out in terms of just like record pace development, built out a lot of incredible features. For context, Splinterlands, for example, invented rental markets for NFTs. We've done over 2 billion rentals of NFTs now over the last few years, right? So like really, really cool stuff that I think has changed the dynamic of how people think about assets in these ecosystems, right? Like you don't need to be, one of the problems that we identified, for example, in Web3 gaming or metaverses is in a lot of cases, you need to be essentially a millionaire to participate in these ecosystems because the asset prices go up so fast at the start. Like once there's like a bunch of interest, it sort of skyrockets and it makes it very difficult for anyone else to start being part of these ecosystems. And so we actually believe very much in a future where all of these assets can be rented. One of those ways could be, for like a small rental fee, right? But that still can be difficult for a new player coming in. And sort of the other way that we're looking at it is, being able to rent it on a rev share basis. So there's actually no financial commitment up front. You're just committing to a part of what you're going to earn. And that I think is a really interesting aspect as part of being able to onboard a lot of people into Web3.
Yeah, so my conviction, I think in large, came through a sense of community. So when I entered the space, 2018, 2019, and I'm originally from the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, okay? Blockchain's not a big topic in Wisconsin. In fact, the whole kind of cloudwhite persona came from not having an outlet to talk about these things or to create involving these things. So, very early on, I identified that community would be a big, thing that would propel NFTs forward. And I would do things like make music videos. I got the first Axie tattoo, and all of these kind of like creative endeavors mixed with the people that I was getting involved with really, I think, was the sticking note for me. And now there's a big group of us that actually all kind of live together in the same region. So we've brought it very much into our real life. So my conviction came through that. And then, of course, some of the things that we're talking about over here as far as continuing to progress, right? Like they didn't abandon the project. We're still building. We're still always moving forward. And so that kind of collective conviction, moves things forward for us.
And what about other metaverses? Is there anything that you're maybe eyeing right now or interested in?
Yeah, I could take that one quick first. So over the course of the last 5 years, I've actually purchased a number of different types of metaverse land, everything from Decentraland to crypto voxels, so on and so forth. And one of the big sticking points for me with Axie Infinity was actually kind of this experience that tied together into one core game. So one thing I've noticed running around Decentraland is, there might be something interesting going on one plot, but then you have to run through, God knows what distance to get to the next interesting thing. It's kind of disconnected. I've enjoyed this idea that metaverse games will have kind of a core experience and then hopefully we can build outward. But currently, as far as other land that I'm looking at, I just started buying Wolf Game, actually, getting into the Wolf Game community.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. But we've been buying assets in all sorts of different ecosystems. I mean, we own tons of NFTs and assets across, top projects on everything from Tezos, Ethereum, Solana, all sorts of stuff. So, even in our fund, we can buy directly into sales of NFTs. And I think it's a big advantage because, we've got a team that also helps us understand these, look at, a lot of these different aspects that I also mentioned over this talk. And so that allows us to really deep dive and try to understand the financial side, the timing, how quickly can we start generating a yield, what does that yield potentially look like? And I think that's sort of informed a lot of our decisions on where we've put capital so far.
Nice. All right, one more from me, and then we're going to open up to audience Q&A. We're going to have two people with microphones come down here, so if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up, and we'll be bringing the mic around. But just one last one from me. I just wanted to know about governance. So, are you actually putting forward proposals? Are you voting on anything? I'm interested to know, is it consequential, or is it just, a lot of the DAO theater that we're seeing? And, does the community actually get a say, or is it just a bunch of whales kind of dominating decision making? I'd love to understand like how that experience has been from your own perspective.
Yeah, I can touch on this, right? So DAO governance is extremely important. Now, the problem with most DAO governance, as you sort of alluded to, is it's not really decentralized, right? So in the vast majority of DAOs that you hear about, if someone tells you, like, go talk to these 3 people and you can get a proposal through, it is not a DAO, right? That's not decentralized. And this is very common. Like if you ask someone like, oh, how do I sort of get more involved here? And someone's like, talk to these 2 people, they'll make it happen. Not good, right? And I think this is a big problem around DAOs. Now, I think there are some good examples of actually very decentralized ecosystems that don't have, say, like massive whales that can control it. Splinterlands is actually a really good example, right? So we've been participating very heavily in Splinterlands governance, and I think what's sort of really exciting there is the sort of probably the largest stakeholders of SPS there is maybe don't even control 1% of the actual votes that are going on. So yeah, I think it's quite decentralized, and you can see, every single thing that people are voting on. There's like an entire portion that sort of happens off of the game. So there's another site where sort of pre-proposals go through. Once they pass there, they go onto the main platform also to sort of ensure there's not like a lot of clutter, a lot of things that people don't want to be seeing. But then the team actually is implementing these things in like record pace when the community drives proposals. So anyone can put a proposal in. I mean, I saw a proposal the other day that went through, and I think within a couple of weeks, they actually launched an entirely new card based on the proposal from the community that passed, right? And so there is some really, really cool things. We've launched proposals as well in the Splinterlands ecosystem. So I think it's a really great thing. I do want to see more of this happening in other ecosystems, especially where it actually is decentralized. And I think it's a scary thing for founders, though, sometimes, right? So there's a benefit to it being decentralized and listening to your community, but there's also a risk in the sense that you're kind of giving up a lot of power, control in a lot of ways to the community. And so there's a pro and con to it, of course.
Well, and just jumping straight to decentralization isn't the way to go either. So kind of getting that pacing right is important too, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What about you, cloudwhite?
Yeah, so for us with Axie Infinity, Axie Homeland, the first season actually just dropped. We started that, I think it was the last week in December of 2022. So our land game, as far as an accessible, playable thing, is actually a relatively new thing. As far as governance is concerned, we have a community board that then works hand in hand with Sky Mavis on what direction our governance will go in. So I know, for instance, one of the big things they're trying to tackle is, AXS is our governance token. We don't want whales to be able to come in and just dominate the landscape and be able to vote things into will, right, just financially. So one of the things that we're trying to really focus on is how can we come up with, for lack of a better term, some kind of social score or other factors that will play into how our governance works long term. And I think that obviously creates a whole new set of challenges that we're trying to work through. So for us, it's kind of slow and steady because, to your point, we don't want to do anything that we can't reverse or creates damage or gives over too much control to everyone in the wrong way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I think there's a lot of criticism, as we just kind of covered, in terms of DAOs not being decentralized enough, but it's not something you want to rush either, because otherwise, if those frameworks and I guess foundations aren't in place, could actually have the reverse effect of what you're actually going for. Do we have any questions from the audience? Someone like to ask a question? Any burning questions about virtual land? Over here? Take it away.
Oh, sure. I just had a little question about the whole Sky Mavis Axie relationship. Are you guys when you're talking about governance stuff, is that like hard fork related stuff, or what's that relationship like?
I should be clear, I don't work for Sky Mavis or Axie, so I can't actually speak to that angle. But as far as governance, I guess what I'm speaking to, or what I just commented on, is things within the land play game specifically. So that's where the governance focus is there. Ultimately, I think Sky Mavis ends up with 20% of the AXS tokens, which will play a large role in our voting system, I'm quite sure. But yeah, the governance board that the community, put together, working with Sky Mavis in particular, is, the land and the Axie IP, hopefully.
We've also got Jihos from Sky Mavis here, so if you've got any Axie-specific questions,
yeah,
you
there
might be
he
able
is.
to help out. He's like, no. I think we've got, sorry. I think we've got another question up the back here. Oh, down the front. Yep.
Hi. I'm very curious to find out, where do you see the metaverse growing? Just because a lot of the experiences right now are very basic, and a lot of the players in the experiences are doing it to earn versus because it's actually fun. So when do you think we're going to get to that broader adoption where you're actually wanting to play?
When does it get fun?
Yeah.
Do you want it to? You can
When
take that one
fun.
first. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a problem when you think about all the different genres of games, and then, when you think about which ones are actually really fun when you take out the financial aspects. I think this is definitely a challenge. And until you get that right, the financial aspects won't always make sense, because you won't be able to keep the engagement levels to basically be able to drive the other aspects of sort of the flywheel effectively as part of the economy. So this is a good question. I mean, we see a lot of games in terms of our deal flow. I mean, probably we see more than 100 to 150 new games a month in terms of companies that we directly see as a fund. But I think really it's about some of these guys actually implementing like very strong microeconomics into their game that sort of makes sense as part of that engagement flywheel. I mean, with Splinterlands, we've got very strong metrics of like player retention, which I think proves that there's, it's actually a very fun game and it's very dynamic. Every time you play a match, every 2 minutes, the rule sets change. So it's like almost like a very deeply engaged strategy game that's consistently changing. But, we need to see this in more and more different genres of games that I think are engaging. And I think it's, hopefully over the next year or two, we see more of these promised games launch their products and actually be able to hit some of these retention numbers, and that I think will sort of hit that point.
Yeah, just to follow up on your point about, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. So first of all, I think we're all kind of waiting for the Ready Player DAO, or not Ready Player DAO, the Ready Player One kind of experience, right? Not the fucking DAO. And when is that coming? To your point, the economic loops feel like those are what we're trying to sort of figure out first. And for us, in particular with Axie Land Play, it might not just be that Axie Land Play is the game that filters into the Axie Land Play ecosystem. So there could be other sort of side games that then contribute to your play within, the Axie Land. And those could be any array of types of games. And so for us, really, it's just like, I think it's more a matter of time, right? How can we not only continue to build things out as a community, but then the things that Sky Mavis and the studios that they're bringing on are, adding to the ecosystem as a whole. So hopefully we get there soon.
Just to tease on something that you mentioned too, sorry, just quickly, you mentioned the word expand. How do we expand on the metaverse? And I thought that was a really great question, because I think one of the biggest criticisms from people who are not already bought into virtual land is that it's not scarce. People can just kind of create new virtual land as they want. And I heard you guys mentioning something very interesting about how to maintain scarcity, but also increase capacity at the back. So could you just comment on that briefly? Because I thought that was really interesting idea there.
Yeah. So one thing that we look at when we look at the Axie Infinity map is there's something like 63,000 ownable plots on the entire map. Now this includes 3/4 of the map that hasn't even been sold yet. So obviously this creates a supply issue for your average player. And one thing that we've talked about on the land board in development discussions is a possibility of moving forward with delegations. So being able to rent out your space on your land. Maybe we build vertically, like apartments, so that people can, enjoy that land experience without necessarily owning the property, in which it's taking place. So that's something that we've found really interesting, is like this idea, like, yeah, we need to make a larger capacity for players ultimately, but how do we get there when there's scarcity, within the supply?
Very similar to like city planning for a dense city. Yeah. Did you have anything you want to add to that,
Yeah,
Ali?
I mean, I think there's a lot that's always still like moving pieces, right? So even with Splinterlands, when we invested in the land many years ago, like we didn't know all the details of where it could entirely go, right? So there's generally like some sort of vision. Now over time, they launched Land 1.0, they're launching Land 1.5 in a month or so. And so we're starting to see a lot of this sort of come into play. And so in Splinterlands, it's, you know, you've got to actually produce on the land. And so there's all sorts of ways and different like resources that are part of that. And then we're using it as almost like an NFT sync where you need to basically like work the land with some of your NFTs. And so it's actually making the NFTs more scarce as well, which is also a really important aspect. When you think about scarcity, it's also about scarcity of the actual NFTs, which if they're not scarce, then they're worthless, right? So there's all of these other types of aspects and things that are also all sort of interconnected.
Got it. We've got about 4 minutes left. Do we have a question up the back? Yeah, go for it. And we've got one more down here. So this lady in the red, she'll be next. Yeah. We've got one more up the back first. Yeah.
Thank you. So I heard the Ready Player One example. I guess that's like a real open metaverse where, you know, everything is like interoperable and stuff like that. Is there some kind of common ground in terms of like the technological implementation? Like, for example, does everybody need to use Vox models? So, you know, is Vox the default, you know, of this open metaverse? Like, is there a seamless way to kind of bridge all this stuff together? Or where do you guys see like the interoperability going ultimately?
That's like the holy grail question.
Did I mention I'm an avant-garde film major? Yeah. You know, maybe one day. You know, another project I'm involved with is CyberKongs, and they definitely have those VX models. You know, and that could play into this larger open metaverse type thing. But you know, to a point I was saying earlier, for us with the Axie Infinity Land, I think what's interesting about us and our experience is we're trying to create this core experience, right? And maybe eventually we have experiences that you can build on top of your land that maybe pour it out to other things, what have you. But yeah, as far as technically, I wouldn't even know where to begin.
I mean, I think it's one of those things where there's going to be a lot of metaverses, right? And I think the question is really like how much or how many and how spread across this gets, right? Like there's sort of like two worlds that we see as a fund. Like one is a world where basically like everybody has a metaverse almost, right? Like it's like every company almost has a metaverse in their own experience as a way, almost like their website. And that's like a very different way of thinking about it than, you know, maybe you've got like different genres and like a couple leaders on each genre, but there's, you know, a lot of consolidation that then happens, right? So we still don't have the answer to that. And interoperability is very important then when you start figuring out how to connect these. But I think we're still pretty far from there.
Great question. Thank you. I think we've got a lady here. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning, Ali in Cloud. I actually have two questions. So the first is, do you think DAO is enough to assure that everybody can access, Metaverse will be accessible to everyone? And if the answer is not, so do we need other kind of self-governance mechanism to assure that Metaverse can be accessible to everybody? Thank you.
Great question about accessibility and inclusivity. Who wants to take that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that access is probably a very different question to DAOs, right? Like DAOs is essentially how you govern something, but access, I mean, is going to be based on sort of that ecosystem, right? But ideally, there's sort of like open access to be able to be part of some of these ecosystems. Some of them might be more closed or more like niche based, but I think it's still quite different when you think about like access versus like governance. In terms of governance, again, like DAOs, I think are still fairly early as a test case, in my opinion, right? Like there's a lot of different models, a lot of ways people are testing things. Did we really figure out the right governance models and everything that's going to work? Probably not, right? It's still going to evolve. And it doesn't even mean there's going to be one right answer, right? Like what works in one ecosystem might actually be different from another. And so DAOs is just maybe like the overarching term of how, you know, like essentially all the different types of governments would fit under the term DAOs, but I don't think we figured out what all those underpinnings are yet to how this sort of entire piece could work.
Yeah, to your point, it's going to be a long process. If you think about it, even with Axie and Splinterlands, we're only, 5 years in total? And, you know, a lot of this has not been done before in many different ways. And so figuring out the right way to navigate that, I think, takes a little bit of patience and time. Yeah, soon, TM.
That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But that has been a fantastic conversation. Please give our speakers a round of applause. And we're going to take a short break now, but I hope you can join us in about 15 minutes because we're going to have a discussion about the cultural divide that is currently widening in the metaverse and how builders in the East are envisioning the metaverse differently to those in the West. Quick tip, we're also going to see some footage and some sound from one of the best attended metaverse concerts ever, which attracted over 20 million people to it back in 2021, and I bet you never heard of it. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.